Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we have a question from Guacamole Games, who asked, "Hey Thor, at this point I'm just ready to see the show to be able to judge on how I feel," and they're talking about the Acolyte here. "Let's be honest, there's already plot holes within the story that people just blow over, like for instance Leia knowing about her mother. I mean, George wrote the script of The Phantom Menace a long time ago, and not everything has to be built around 100% what was said 25 years ago. I mean, there's no way for the story to really grow if everything is just set in concrete. Who's to say that this is just such a minor inconvenience on the Jedi's blip that later on when Darth Maul actually shows up they don't believe because the last time they weren't as crazy, as powerful as what, like Darth Vader or Darth Maul or the Emperor are, they're just an acolyte. They say there hasn't been a Sith in a long time. There's a difference between being a Sith Lord and just a dark side user in my opinion." Okay, so first of all, and please take no offense to anything I may say here, I appreciate the question and the conversation, but I do have to disagree about a story being unable to grow if everything is set in concrete. I mean, stories are interesting and worth exploring because things are set in concrete, because one event is relevant to and or builds off the previous ones that cannot be changed or disregarded in order to perhaps do something cool in the moment, if you will. Stories are essentially consistent and coherent narratives, and if what happens before is simply changed on a whim, why do I or should I care about what's happening now or what is going to happen next? If you get to the end of a book and it suddenly completely changes without some type of good in-story explanation, things that happened in the first few chapters, that somehow something completely different took place now, and it greatly impacts the ending, are you going to consider that a good, well-written story and be happy you spent time reading it? Furthermore, I'd argue that the whole point or exciting part of a shared universe, one of the main draws of it, is that everything is concrete and relevant to what's happened before and what will happen next. That it can't or won't be changed. That really kind of is the big selling point of something like the MCU, right? That the movie or show you're watching right now has the exact same character in it from elsewhere. And what they do in the here and now is going to impact or have been affected by what happens before or what will happen next. The reason why you want to see or know a character's backstory or see how past events played out is because you want all that happened before to have directly shaped in a coherent manner who they are or what's going on now in the story. If you're going to do a series that's meant to set up, say, the return of the Sith or what they've been up to for 1,000 years in hiding, as well as what went wrong with the Jedi of the prequel era, like the Acolyte is kind of claiming it will, it has to align with how we know things will be in the prequels, or why tell that story? Or why claim you're telling that story? Why not simply tell a different one at a different point on the timeline with the Jedi and Sith if you want to? That doesn't have to align so closely with something else. And the answer to that is simple, isn't it? It's because part of the draw or desire or selling point of the Acolyte, in theory anyway, is because it will align with the prequels and explain why things are the way they are in those films for both the Jedi and the Sith. I mean, one of the best books of the EU, maybe the best, was the Plagueis novel, and it aligns perfectly with the prequels. It wasn't in any way sort of hamstrung by the events of those films. It didn't limit what it could be. In fact, part of what makes that book so good is it does beholden itself so closely to the events of the prequels, not even shying away from something like the midichlorians that were certainly controversial when they first were introduced, and still are to this day, I'd argue. But instead of avoiding them and saying, those aren't in concrete and they're limiting what I can do, they fully embrace them, and it works, and it even makes them better. And thus, by doing that, by respecting the rest of the story being set in concrete, it feels like a true extension and enhancement of the rest of that story of the prequels, while also being a great story or book in its own right. And I'm sorry, but any worthwhile writer who wants to create in the Star Wars galaxy, or any shared universe really, well, they should be able to tell a story that is, by and large, consistent with anything and everything else it is going to be connected to. It's not this near impossible feat to make things fit or be consistent. It's not being limited by the lore when the existence of that lore is what's allowing you to tell the story in the first place. This all really isn't that hard if you want to honor Star Wars and have some talent. You should be able to write a story in the Star Wars galaxy that is consistent and good. And I say it should be by and large consistent because no, we fans shouldn't get upset at a small, tiny little detail being off or wrong or inconsistent from time to time. It would be very, very difficult to always get absolutely everything, again, every microscopic detail perfectly aligned. Not to mention here, sometimes characters can be wrong in story and it can be a perfectly fine explanation for an apparent plot hole. For example, you brought up Leia saying how she remembers her mother, her real mother, as a plot hole. And considering Padme died moments after Leia was born, and thus there's no way she should remember her unless she remembers her from her literal birth. Anyway, though sure we could argue that's a plot hole, we could instead take it into consideration that Leia is simply wrong or misremembering something from her childhood and apparently from when she was very, very young. I mean, who's to say she hasn't, maybe when she was, again, much, much younger, as she kind of claimed, that she had a vision of Padme through the Force, and that's what she's remembering or thinking of as real memories and feelings. What if her adoptive parents told her stories and showed her pictures of Padme at some point, and this is somehow what Leia is remembering as, again, real memories of her mother? In other words, it can have a really simple and easy explanation, even if it likely is just George Lucas not caring that it perfectly aligned. Another sort of example of this was from a book from about 5 years ago now, a book called Alphabet Squadron, when a character in that book said something along the lines of how Luke wasn't the real hero behind the destruction of the first Death Star, that he only fired the last shot and it was actually Jyn Erso that was the real hero, or something along those lines. I do not remember the exact quotes here, but I do remember a lot of people who probably didn't read the book, they got upset at that, despite it simply being the opinion of a character in the book, one they're certainly free to have in story, especially considering that character who holds that opinion once met Jyn Erso, and thus may be more prone to favor her heroic actions over Luke's. And sure, don't get me wrong, it does feel like that book or the author may have been trying to take a jab at Luke, but that character in story having that opinion changes nothing about how the story actually played out. And the same basically goes for Leia apparently misremembering or remembering her mother. It changes or impacts nothing and could be nothing more than Leia being wrong, which characters in stories can certainly be. However, going back to the Acolyte, and granted, we have not seen it yet and we do not know what is going to happen or how things could play out or any possible explanations for things that could make it all make sense. I did a video on this the other day, sort of speculating on how it potentially could work. But at face value right now, the Jedi having encountered some sort of dark side user and one who was apparently quite powerful, if what we see in the trailer is to be believed, what with the big force wave they unleash. But if that all is something to be believed, it's really not something the Jedi of the prequels would have likely forgotten or disregarded so quickly and easily 100 years later. And it really would need a sort of explanation, otherwise it doesn't align with the story as we know it, and I'd argue breaks the sort of immersion factor of the shared universe, where, as I talked about before, part of the attraction of it is the consistency, is how things are set in concrete and can't be changed. And finally here, going back to the end comment there where you said there's a difference between a Sith and a dark side user, and I mean, sure, there's a difference, and that difference is power level essentially. If you're a weak Force user who can barely wield it, and you do some dark side tricks, no one's going to think of you or call you a Sith, but it's very likely the dark side will corrupt you all the same. That's the whole problem with the dark side. Using it will consume you and change you. Being selfish and using power only to further your own ends comes with it a price in the Star Wars galaxy. And thus, in theory, the Jedi would take it seriously if they encounter anyone who can and is using the dark side to almost any degree. And they're really not going to care if you call yourself a Sith or a Dark Jedi or a Fallen Jedi or whatever other name you want to attach to it. The end result is the same. Someone who has fallen to the dark side and is a threat to the galaxy and the balance of the Force. And so what this show must do, in my opinion, what the Acolyte must do is explain how, from the looks of the trailer, which could be misleading, how the Jedi encountered someone strong with the dark side and seemingly forgot about it or didn't consider it significant enough to remember 100 years later, when the Sith most certainly did return, and they were no doubt looking for clues as to how that happened. Or maybe they all die encountering this Sith, and that remains a mystery. How all these Jedi died remains a mystery, and the Jedi were this close to discovering the Sith 100 years before the prequels and changing how everything played out down the road. Either way, my point is simply that the canon matters, and that things being in concrete is part of the appeal, arguably one of the main appeals, of something like Star Wars. At least for me, and I'd wager many other fans out there. And I just disagree that the previous stories limit new ones when, again, part of the appeal is the connection to those other stories, And the fact that we're talking about a galaxy here, and in all reality, potentially billions upon billions of years of history, if the creator wants freedom, they can certainly find it in Star Wars. But if you want people to watch your show because it's connected to something else that they enjoy, like the prequels, well then you really should be consistent with the prequels. Well, that's all I got for this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think. Is the canon limiting, or is it part of what makes Star Wars interesting? That events are or should be consistent and it leads to one larger story? You can also leave a question for a future lightning response video. All you got to do is start your comment off with "Hey Thor" and then ask away. But whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.